Okay, the last two times we spoke about Chameshes Min Dagan and different questions about what the bracha is on them. And there's some things we have to just wrap up today, just to finish off the topic. Really, some things we mentioned we were going to talk about, and this and that. Anyhow, let's just wind them down. Okay, the first is about the Bracha Acharonah. So, if a person eats bread, they make Bracha Samazon. If you eat, excuse me, most other foods, the bracha on that, the Bracha Acharonah is burn nefashos. But between those, there's one other Bracha Acharonah that a person can make, and that is when a person eats one of the Shivas Haminim, one of the 7 special grains from Eretz Yisrael, and the bracha is called Bracha Achas Starch. That's what it's officially called, and it has 3 variations depending on which one of the Shivas Haminim a person ate. If you have wine or grape juice, then you say al gefen, the variation called al gefen. If you have grapes, figs, pomegranates, olive, and dates, there's 5 of the Chameshes Min Dagam, then you say al ha'etz. And if you have food that's made from the Chameshes Min Dagan, which are part of the Shivas Haminim also, then the Bracha Acharonah on them is al hamichya. Now, you don't make al hamichya no matter what when you eat Chameshes Min Dagan, and it really depends on what the Bracha Rishona was that you made on that food. So if you made hamaitzi, you would have benched on it. If you made shahakal, we saw that there are times when you eat Chameshes Min Dagan and you make shahakal, then the bracha is bar nefashos. The time when we really say al hamichya is the primary time to say it is when the bracha rishona was mazonos. Then we can't bench, but we also don't need to make bar nefashos. So that's the main case when we say al hamichya. Now, so Taisus then says have a shaila. So we've talked about what happens if you made hamaitzi, shahakal, or mazonos as the bracha rishona. Taisus says, what about if I made in the cases where the bracha rishona is hadama? Now for us, and a prime example of that is granola bars. That in some cases we've mentioned in the past, the bracha will be hadama, and there are other cases like that also. So Taisus says the person can't really say al hamichya because he didn't say a mazonos beforehand. But maybe Taisus says maybe there should be another variation of the bracha achas mein shalish, like a 4th variation, which would be for cases like this where you ate something that provides nutrition, but you didn't eat it in a way that would allow you to say al hamichya. So, or it says maybe you shouldn't do that because first of all, you ate this grain in an unusual way. That in itself should raise questions. And second is maybe we can't make up our own variations. The Gemara has these 3 variations of how to make the bracha achas mein shalish. Maybe we should make up our own. So because it's not so clear what to do, so Shulchan Aruch says l'chatchila you should not eat these foods except if you're at a meal that you're going to bench at anyhow. In which case that Bracha Samazon will surely cover whatever bracha this was supposed to have, so you'll be safe. Okay, which is reminiscent of another thing Shulchan Aruch says about donuts, things that are fried, deep fried. Where there he has a question also about what bracha you should make and gives the same suggestion. Again, Ashkenazim rule a little differently there, but Shulchan Aruch there has a similar idea which says to only eat it during a meal. And the Mishnah Berurah says that if you didn't do this and you ate the food that you made the hadam on from Chameshes Min Dagan and you made hadam like you were supposed to, then because of the question, you should just recite bar nefashos and you should not say any kind of like al hamichya type of a thing. Okay, that's one thing I want to mention was about this question about the Bracha Acharonah. Next is the rule called Kol Sheyesh Bo, and that is like this: if a food is made of a blend of different ingredients that don't have the same bracha, then the general rule is the bracha rishona that you recite on that food is whatever is the main part of that food. It's called ikr. Those set of rules are called ikr v'tafel. The bracha goes by the ikr, the main ingredient, the primary ingredient, and we ignore the bracha that would have been there, that should have been for the tafel, the secondary ingredient. Okay, so how do you decide which is the ikr and which is the tafel? So sometimes it's very obvious. Like if you have French fries and you dip them into ketchup, then the potatoes are the ikr and the ketchup is the tafel. So you make the bracha on the potatoes and you ignore the ketchup that's on there. Sometimes, in a lot of other cases, it's not so obvious which one it is, and then the bracha follows whichever one is the main the ingredient that has the largest volume in the mix. If there's 60% of this and 40% of this, you make the bracha based on the 60%, since it wasn't obvious which is the ikr besides that. Now, while on that, before we get back to our case, I'll just mention Rebelsky said from Moshe that if a person has we call it a fruit cup. Okay, and the fruit cup has in it 30% cantaloupe, 30% pineapples, and 40% grapes. So cantaloupe and pineapple, the bracha on those is both hadama, and grapes, the bracha is ha'etz. So what Moshe said is the bracha you should make on this is hadama. That is, even though the largest volume is a grape, the grape is 40%. He says, but the largest amount of bracha is hadama, because the cantaloupe and the pineapple together are 60%, and therefore you follow that's considered the one with the most volume, even though it's not the one that has the plurality. It's not the one that has the most. The actual thing with the most of is grapes, but since the bracha with the most is hadam, you make hadam. Okay, back to our case over here. The Gemara says like this: the chameshes mina dagan are so prominent and so important that they are automatically the ikar of a food they're in, even if volume-wise there's much more of the other ingredients. So whereas usually when we're not sure what's the ikar, we follow whatever has the majority is there. For the chameshes mina dagan, we don't follow that rule, and instead we say Kol Sheyesh Bo chameshes haminim, and if there's any of the chameshes haminim in there, is automatically the bracha follows those of the chameshes hamina. Now, I'll just mention that there are two places where the Gemara actually uses those words Kol Sheyesh Bo. Excuse me, maybe there are more, but two that I know of. One is about a case called Chavetz Kedera. One is called a case of Riyat Mechuza. And in both cases, the Gemara, right before it says Kol Sheyesh Bo, it says you should know that either everyone holds or some hold that in that food, the other ingredient in the food, not the chameshes mina dagan, the other thing is the ikar. And the Gemara says that would be true, but Kol Sheyesh Bo, and therefore the chameshes mina is considered to be the ikar. So that is to say, is the Gemara is saying is that we're looking at a food that logically, if a person looked at this food, they would say the other ingredient is the ikar. It's only when because of the rule says, even though people looking at this would assume that the other ingredient is the ikar, don't say that and say Kol Sheyesh Bo. Not to say, rather than saying is that Kol Sheyesh Bo says that people really think that's the ikar. It's not really true. It's Chazal telling us to treat it as the ikar, even if we on our own might have not thought that it was the ikar. Okay, anyhow, so we have this rule, Kol Sheyesh Bo, that when the chameshes mina dagan are sort of speak automatically considered the ikar, even though if there's more of the other things. Now, it sounds like an absolute rule, but it's not really true. Okay, there's at least 6 exceptions to the rule that I'm aware of, and they are if the grain is there just as a thickener, lahak foisei, or if it's a binder, let's call it dabig, or if it's for aroma, litain reach, or for color, tzvaya, or there's the other food is that you're eating is very sharp, so you put in some of the chameshes mina dagan to temper the taste a little bit. That's a shleish. You can't have big groin. Or there's even a case where you don't want to get your hands dirty, so you use this some kind of a dough or something on the outside to keep it from a messy food. It's called shloit yitan fenu hayadayim. Yitan for yadayim. So there, in other words, we have this rule Kol Sheyesh Bo, but there's exceptions to the rule. There are exceptions where it's so obvious that the grain is not an ikar, the chameshes mina dagan is not an ikar, that we don't say Kol Sheyesh Bo. So if in a regular case we will say that, and in fact that's what we do. Usually we look at a cereal or a candy or some other food with a little bit of flour in it. We say, you know what? Usually we assume it's if qualifies for Kol Sheyesh Bo, and the bracha is accordingly will be zonas or hamoitzi, whatever the bracha would be is. But sometimes there'll be exceptions, and we'll note there are these different exceptions when we say no. It's obvious that this is not the ikar, and therefore the bracha is not going to follow the Kol Sheyesh Bo. Now, that idea that there are exceptions to the rule Kol Sheyesh Bo raises questions about a whole group of foods I'm going to mention. We're not going to talk about them. It's beyond what we could talk about now. But just to mention that there's these shaylas, I'll mention some of the foods. The one that's very common, I'll talk more about this in a second, breaded fish or chicken, like fish sticks or shnitzel. So again, there's chameshes mina dagan on there. Excuse me. But seemingly the main ingredient is the chicken or the fish. Licorice, which is commonly made with flour to thicken it. Ice cream cones that you eat with an ice cream, or ice cream sandwiches. So do we say Kol Sheyesh Bo? We make mazonos on this, or not? A kinesh. or breadcrumbs or flour that you add to ground meat to sort of extend it, to get more for your money or more out of it, or gefilte fish that has breadcrumbs or flour in it. Okay, and all these kinds of other cases. That for these kind of cases, for each of them, there's shilas whether we should apply the rule of Kol Sheyesh Bo, or should we say that the grain in this case somehow qualifies as one of the exceptions when we don't say Kol Sheyesh Bo. So just about shnitzel, I'll mention it. Some of the poskim have said it. Several of the poskim have said what's quoted in the name of Moshe. It's in L'Torah V'Hara, it's in Rabbi Badner's Sefer, and there also was Rabbi Yaakov who said is that the chicken or the fish is the ikr. The coating on the outside is a tuffle, except they said is if it's a really thick coating, then that shows that the person really wants it as part of the food, and therefore then you make, in that case, you make mazonos. Rav Vosner said coatings are automatically tuffle to a food. It makes no difference. If it's just a coating on something, that's an automatic tuffle. Then the Rabbi Yashiv in different places said different things, and in Asher Ish it says that the reason why you see different quotes, whether it's Mazonis or Shahakal, is because originally he held the bracha was Mazonis. Later he changed his mind and held that the bracha should be the right bracha should be Shahakal. Okay, so there's different opinions about this, and again, all this whole group of foods, there are lots who have spoken about this, but it's not for today. Maybe for a different time. Okay, our last bunch of topics have to do with a little bit different than what we did until now, and that is we've spoken about if a person takes a grain and he eats it in different forms, or he removes part of the grain. He scrapes off the outer layers, the bran, and part of the endosperm, different parts like that. But now we want to talk about a little bit of a different case. When you take certain parts of the grain and you don't leave the main grain behind. You're separating apart. And I'm going to have my examples are as follows. My things I want to talk about are as follows. The simplest case is the bran itself. What happens if you took off the bran and you left, and now what you ate was the endosperm, the main starchy part of the food. What happens if you eat the bran itself? Okay, so several places can say, Moshe says it, and Rav Vosner says it, probably others as well, that if you take the bran and you eat it by itself, or you take the bran and use it in a recipe, the bracha is shahakal. Okay, even though when you keep the bran in a whole wheat flour, it's part of the flour. That's not true if you eat the bran by itself, and this is very reminiscent of a halacha in Hilchas Challah, which is you only have to be mafresh challah if you have a certain amount of flour in the mix, and that's called the shir challah. You have a certain amount in there, and if you make a flour that includes bran, then the bran counts towards the shir. But if you take the bran out and add it in later on, then the bran does not count towards the shir, because the bran is not really a part of the bread. If it was left in there, it just sort of goes along with it. But if it comes in afterwards, it's not considered part of the bread or part of the flour. And therefore, similar over here, we're saying is that if the bran, if you eat it by itself or you eat it in another food, it doesn't count, and you would not make mazonos or whatever like that. The bracha would be shahakal. Okay, now, but a more complicated question than the bran is, what happens if you make a food out of wheat gluten? Okay, what's wheat gluten? In the endosperm, the main part of the endosperm is starch. Okay, but it also contains a protein, which we refer to that protein as gluten. Now, aside from that, the protein has nutritional value by itself. That eating protein is good for you. It also plays a very critical role when you want to make bread, and that's because when you add yeast to flour, and it starts to rise, what's happening is that gases are being formed from the yeast acting on the flour, and as those gases start trying to escape from the dough, gluten traps the gases in, and that causes the dough to expand, to rise, because the gas is trying to get out. It's like pushing its way out. The gluten is holding it in, so it's sort of stretching out the dough, and the dough then fluffs up to become this fluffy, what we think of as bread. Okay, so if you make bread from a flour that didn't have any gluten in it, it wouldn't get that fluffiness because the gas would just escape, and you wouldn't get any. It wouldn't be bread like. It would just be this flat, just nothing fermented dough. So it's pretty easy to get gluten out of flour. You could do it at home if you wanted to. You make a dough, And what happens is if you wash dough, you just turn on the sink and let the water run through it. What happens is the starch is water soluble. It comes out, it just gets dissolved into the water and leaves the dough, and leaving behind the gluten, which does not dissolve in the water. It's non-water soluble. Now, what would anybody do with gluten? Just the gluten by itself. So sometimes it's added to winter wheat. Winter wheat doesn't have a lot of gluten in it. Not so good for making bread. So if you add gluten into winter wheat, you change it from winter wheat into bread flour, or high protein flour it's called, or what we might think of as spring wheat. You boost it by adding more gluten into it. Or some people eat gluten by itself, and they make this thing called seitan, which is a vegan meat substitute. It tastes somehow like meat, and it's made from wheat gluten. Or if people are on a keto diet, then they don't want to have any starch, but they want the protein, so they take the gluten and they use that as part of their diet, and they make whatever food they make out of it. Okay, so what's the bracha on seitan? What's the bracha if you take a food, it has gluten, but it doesn't have any regular flour? So, on the one hand, you could say it's like bran. I took part of the flour out. When it's in there, it counts as part of the flour. But when I take it out, maybe it should be like bran and not count as part of the flour. And then the bracha should be shahakal. But it seems, I think that there's a better argument to say that the bracha, that it is considered part of the flour, and if you eat seitan, you should make mazonos on it. And that goes like this. It's very different than bran. Bran is fiber. Doesn't give you any regular, so to speak, nutritional value to it. And it's considered to negatively affect the taste of bread. It's considered like a white flour is the finer flour without the bran into it. So the bran is, so to speak, a negative all around. So if we take the bran out, we've taken something that's basically not the real bread, not the real flour, and we took it out, so we make a shak on it. On the other hand, but in contrast to that, gluten is part of the endosperm. It's not an outside piece. It's actually part of the endosperm. Not only is it part of the endosperm, but it plays this very important role when you try to make bread. So if you're taking gluten out of the flour, basically you're taking part of the flour. You're not taking something that doesn't belong in the flour, like sort of an extra piece, and separating it out and saying, okay, I took that stuff that's like garbage out, so I make a shak on it. No, it's like I cut it in half. I took half the flour is there, and the other half is over here. The gluten is just part of the flour. And seemingly, because of that, the bracha should be the same as if you just use plain flour itself, mazonos or amoitzi, or whatever you made it, I think. So that's what I would have thought about it. I will mention that in Sefer V'zos HaBracha, he says not like that. He says the bracha is shahakal. He says, if you remember, we've talked about in the past that the reason why Chamishis Minudagon have these special halachas is because they give you extra, they're amazing, they give extra amount of nutrition. And he says, that extra nutrition comes only from the starch, but that doesn't apply to the protein part of it. Now, it's true that starch does play an important role, giving you energy, etc., for your body to function, but protein is also part of nutrition for people. Not so clear why he's so convinced that it should be correct that the starch should count and not the protein. And also, you could argue that once Chazal said that the bracha on things made out of flour from the endosperm is mazonos, then that includes all parts of it, and that we shouldn't split and say half is and half is not. He then brings this raya, which I did not really understand. He brings rayas that for brachas, we consider the gluten to be something new. And if it's new, not part of the flour, then the bracha is shahakal. But logically, I could understand that. But he brings rayas from a Chazon Ish and Chasam Sofer to that idea. And what's unclear about that is that those rayas are from cases, they're not talking about brachas. They're talking about regular kashrus issues. One is talking about musk, one is talking about grapeseed oil. And the V'zos HaBracha himself says that for regular kashrus related issues, we don't follow this rule of being something new. So it wasn't clear exactly what his prior was. So anyhow, that's what he says. He thinks that the bracha is shahakal. I thought it was more reasonable to say that it's considered part of the grain and the bracha should be mazonos, etc. I'll mention before I finish with this little piece is that we're talking about someone who makes seitan, which is basically all gluten. That's what you're making it out of. But you should know also that there are people who make wraps that don't have starch in them, and they have gluten mixed into them, in many of those cases, the gluten that's in there is in tiny amounts, and it's solely there as a processing aid, like to make it elastic and to keep from cracking and tearing when you're kneading it. All kinds of things that sure sound like the exceptions we had when we would not say Kol Sheyesh Bo. And that, so in those cases, there's good reason to say that the bracha should not be, we should not say Kol Sheyesh Bo for the little bit of gluten in those foods. Okay. Now, I told you all the way you could use gluten. You could separate the gluten out of the flour. But what happens if you do the other way, which is you separate the gluten from the flour, but instead of using the gluten, you use the starch. And wheat starch, again, it's flour. You took the endosperm and you removed the gluten, but instead of what I talked about before, to use the gluten, you use just the starch, and that's all over the place in recipes. In fact, there's even such a thing for people who are celiac, who can't eat gluten. They actually make bread-like foods using just wheat starch. Some of them we call Molino flour. They have special flours that are just pure wheat starch with no gluten in them, that people who are gluten-free are allowed to eat. So that food, that the starch is for sure the main part of the flour, and seemingly everyone should agree that should have the same bracha, either mazonos or hamotzi, as if you made it from plain flour itself. Whereas the wheat starch without the gluten, or the wheat starch with should both be the same din. Okay, one last thing that we talked about in the past was wheat germ. That I thought the bracha was shahaka. Again, others didn't agree. Spoke about that the first time we spoke. That's another piece, so to speak, that could be taken out of the flour or the grain and made into something else.